The story of the Great Train Robbery didn't end when the last mailbag was thrown from the bridge. In many ways, that was just the beginning of a much longer, more complex tale. We remember Part 1, the audacious night of August 8th, 1963. A gang of at least 15 men tampered with railway signals. They stopped the Glasgow to Euston mail train. They made off with £2.6 million in used banknotes, a sum that would be worth over £50 million today. It was a bold stroke, a strike against the establishment, and it immediately set the nation alight with a mixture of shock and, for some, a strange kind of admiration. The sheer nerve of it was, honestly, just breathtaking. Once the train crew, freed from their captivity, managed to raise the alarm, the machinery of British justice whirred into action with remarkable speed. The scale of the crime demanded an equally significant response. Scotland Yard knew this wasn't the work of petty thieves. It was organised and it was big. A dedicated task force, codenamed the Flying Squad, was quickly assembled, drawing in some of the best detectives in the country. Their mission was clear: find the men responsible and recover the stolen money. The pressure was immense, not just from the public, but from the very highest levels of government. This was more than a robbery, it was an affront. The government, and indeed the post office, were reeling. Such a brazen attack on a royal mail train was almost unthinkable. It felt like a direct challenge to the order and security of the nation. The police were under intense scrutiny to deliver results, and quickly. Every newspaper, every radio bulletin was hungry for news. The robbers had momentarily seemed to vanish into thin air, but the police were determined that this vanishing act wouldn't last long. They understood the criminals would need a hideout, a place to count their spoils and plan their next moves. And finding this place became an immediate priority in the investigation's early stages. Initial information was, as you'd expect, quite scarce. The train crew could offer descriptions, but the robbers had been masked. However, the sheer professionalism of the police response was notable. They began by meticulously piecing together the fragments, understanding that a crime of this magnitude would inevitably leave traces. They knew the gang had to make mistakes somewhere along the line. The speed of their mobilization, the resources poured into the hunt, all signaled a relentless pursuit. The thieves had their millions, but the clock was already ticking loudly against them, a countdown initiated by a determined police force. The breakthrough for the police came relatively quickly. A local herdsman, John Maris, became suspicious of the unusual activity at the supposedly vacant farm. He noticed the windows were blacked out and heard voices. He reported his concerns to the local police. On August 13th, just 5 days after the robbery, officers cautiously approached Leatherslade. What they found inside was an investigative goldmine. Mailbags, post office sacks, and wrappers from the stolen money were strewn about. More importantly, the robbers had grown careless. They had left behind personal belongings, food, and critically, their fingerprints all over the place. The most famous or infamous piece of evidence found was a Monopoly set. It seems the gang had passed the time playing the game, perhaps even using some of the real stolen cash as play money. Fingerprints were lifted from the board, from a ketchup bottle, and from other surfaces. These prints were promptly sent to Scotland Yard's Fingerprint Bureau. When run through their records, they matched several known criminals. Suddenly, the police had names, faces, and a direct link to the individuals involved. The instruction to wear gloves at all times had clearly been flouted, a simple human error with enormous consequences. Beyond the crucial fingerprint evidence, other blunders by the gang aided the police. The vehicles used in the robbery and for the getaway were also poorly handled. One of the gang's Land Rovers was found abandoned, not far from the farm. Another vehicle used by some of the robbers to flee Leatherslade had been purchased with cash that could be traced. These seemingly small oversights, born out of haste, overconfidence, or perhaps a lack of foresight for the aftermath, systematically tightened the net around them. The image of a perfectly executed crime began to crumble under the weight of these careless mistakes, paving the way for arrests.
The gang's chosen hideout was Leatherslade Farm, a remote farmhouse near Oakley in Buckinghamshire. It was meant to be their sanctuary, a place to lie low while the initial heat from the robbery died down. They planned to stay for a few days, divide the money, and then disperse. Crucially, the plan involved thoroughly cleaning the farmhouse and then burning it to the ground to destroy any evidence. However, This vital part of the plan was bungled. The gang left in a hurry, perhaps spooked by low-flying RAF aircraft or simply eager to get away with their shares. They left the farm intact, a decision that would prove to be a catastrophic error for them.
In April 1964, the verdicts were delivered, followed by the sentencing. Mr. Justice Edmund Davies, presiding over the trial, handed down sentences that were exceptionally severe. 7 of the main robbers, including Bruce Reynolds, Buster Edwards in absentia as he was still on the run, and Charlie Wilson, received sentences of 30 years imprisonment. The judge described the crime as a sordid crime of violence and greed, inspired by naked avarice. Headlines screamed the news: 30 years for train robbers and savage sentences. The severity aimed to act as a deterrent, a clear message that such crimes would not be tolerated. The public reaction to these lengthy sentences was somewhat divided. On one hand, there was a strong sense of relief and approval. Many felt that justice had been served and that the robbers got what they deserved for such a brazen act and for the violence inflicted on Jack Mills. However, there was also a significant undercurrent of opinion that the sentences were disproportionately harsh, especially when compared to sentences for other violent crimes, even murder at the time. This very debate, this questioning of the punishment, inadvertently began to contribute to the complex mythologizing of the robbers, painting some as anti-establishment figures rather than just convicted felons.
The public followed these developments with intense fascination, devouring newspaper reports that detailed each arrest. The net was closing, and the audacious criminals who had shocked the nation were now facing the full force of the law. The manhunt was proving successful, largely due to the gang's own errors and the diligent work of the police task force. The trial, which commenced in January 1964 at Aylesbury Assizes in Buckinghamshire, was a media sensation. It wasn't just a local affair. Reporters from across the globe descended on the small market town. The sheer number of defendants, 12 men, eventually stood trial together for the robbery itself, made it an unprecedented legal spectacle. The courtroom was packed daily as the prosecution laid out its case, detailing the meticulous planning of the heist and the damning evidence found at Leatherslade. The evidence, particularly the fingerprints, proved hard for the defense to counter effectively, despite their best efforts.
With the evidence from Leatherslade Farm providing solid leads, the police began to round up the suspects. One by one, members of the gang were tracked down and arrested. Figures like Charlie Wilson, Tommy Wisby and Roy James, the racing driver, were taken into custody.
Finally, the idea that the robbers were all gentlemen thieves or charming rogues is a carefully constructed image, largely fueled by media portrayals and the passage of time. In truth, many of the individuals involved were hardened career criminals with extensive records for various offenses, including violence and theft. They were not Robin Hood figures stealing from the rich to give to the poor. They were motivated by personal greed. While some, like Bruce Reynolds, cultivated a more sophisticated persona, the underlying nature of their enterprise was rooted in serious criminal activity, not some romantic ideal of gentlemanly conduct outside the law.
Then there's the myth about the equitable distribution of the spoils. Did the gang share the money fairly amongst themselves? The plan might have been for an equal split, but the reality was far messier. The chaos following the premature abandonment of Leatherslade Farm, the urgent need to go on the run, and the subsequent arrests meant that the division of the £2.6 million was haphazard. Some members likely ended up with significantly more than others, while some who played smaller roles may have received very little. Much of the cash was quickly spent, hidden poorly, or recovered by police, meaning the dream of a shared fortune remained largely unfulfilled.
Another pervasive and damaging myth is that no one was hurt during the robbery. This is demonstrably false. Jack Mills, the driver of the mail train, was brutally coshed over the head with an iron bar by one of the robbers. While the gang later claimed this was not intended to cause serious or lasting harm, Mills suffered severe head injuries. He experienced recurring headaches, blackouts, and psychological trauma for the rest of his life. He was never able to return to his job as a train driver. This violent act is often conveniently glossed over in more romanticized retellings of the heist, but its impact on Mills and his family was profound and tragic.
One of the most persistent myths surrounding the Great Train Robbery is that it was a perfect crime. This narrative suggests a flawless plan executed with military precision by a band of criminal geniuses. The reality, however, is far less glamorous. While undoubtedly audacious and meticulously planned in some aspects, the robbery was riddled with significant errors. The failure to burn Leatherslade Farm, the careless leaving of fingerprints, and the traceable getaway vehicles were all crucial blunders. These mistakes directly led to the swift arrest of most of the gang, proving the crime was far from perfect in its execution or its aftermath for the perpetrators.
Ronnie Biggs remained in Brazil for over 3 decades, but as his health began to fail following a series of strokes, his desire to return to the UK grew stronger. In May 2001, impoverished and ailing, he voluntarily returned to Britain, saying he wanted to walk into a Margate pub as an Englishman and buy a pint of bitter. He was immediately arrested upon arrival and sent back to prison to complete his sentence. Eventually, due to his severe ill health, he was granted compassionate release in August 2009, and he passed away in 2013. Biggs's life story, from petty criminal to train robber to international fugitive, really does read like a far-fetched adventure novel.
Life in Rio, well, it was anything but quiet. I became a bit of a celebrity, to be honest. I hosted parties, gave interviews, sometimes for a fee, and just kind of enjoyed being known as Britain's most wanted man living in plain sight. I even recorded a song, No One Is Innocent, with the Sex Pistols. I guess my cheeky comments and the fact that I didn't really show much remorse just added to the whole legend. I used to say, it's been a blast. And honestly, I meant it. I was the rogue who beat the system, living it up every minute.
At that time, Brazil didn't have an extradition treaty with the United Kingdom for individuals who had a Brazilian child. Biggs soon fathered a son, Michael, with a Brazilian woman, and this legal loophole allowed him to live quite openly, almost taunting the British authorities from afar.
After that escape, I had to keep moving. First, I made my way to Paris, where I actually had plastic surgery to change my appearance. Then I went off to Australia, just trying to live quietly with my family for a few years. But when the police started closing in on me there, I had to run again. This time I ended up in Brazil in 1970.
Yet, despite his relatively small role, Ronnie Biggs became by far the most famous, or perhaps infamous, member of the gang. This reputation was truly cemented by his daring escape from Wandsworth Prison on July 8, 1965. Just 15 months into his 30-year sentence, Biggs scaled the prison wall using a rope ladder and dropped onto a waiting removal van. This audacious breakout captured global headlines and, you could say, transformed him into something of a folk anti-hero for some people.
Well, you know, I wasn't really one of the masterminds behind the Great Train Robbery. My part was actually pretty minor. I was just supposed to arrange for a new driver for the train, but honestly, I didn't even manage to get that right.
One of the most enduring mysteries connected to the Great Train Robbery is the identity of a figure often referred to as the Ulsterman. This individual is believed to have been the crucial insider, the person who provided the gang with detailed information about the mail train's schedule, its route, and most importantly, the unusually large shipment of cash it would be carrying on that specific night. Without this inside knowledge, it's argued, the robbery might never have been attempted, or at least not with such a specific target. His true identity has never been conclusively proven, remaining a subject of intense speculation for decades. Numerous theories have circulated about who the Ulsterman might have been. Some suggest he was a disgruntled postal worker with access to sensitive information. Others believe he could have been a former railway employee, someone familiar with the inner workings of the mail train system. There have even been suggestions of connections to more shadowy figures or even intelligence services, though these are far more speculative. The code of silence among the robbers, combined with a lack of definitive evidence, has meant that this enigmatic figure has remained firmly in the shadows, a ghost in the machine of the Great Heist. Beyond the mystery of the Ulsterman, the fate of the vast majority of the stolen money continues to fascinate. Of the £2.6 million taken, only around £300,000 to £400,000 was ever officially recovered by the police. This leaves over £2 million unaccounted for, a colossal sum, especially by 1963 standards. What happened to this missing fortune? Theories abound. Some believe it was laundered through complex financial schemes, perhaps invested in businesses or property. Others suggest it was buried, hidden in secret locations, or squandered extravagantly by those gang members who managed to evade immediate capture. The idea that a significant portion of the loot was successfully spirited away, perhaps even by the Ulsterman as his payment, adds another layer to the robbery's enduring mystique. It paints a picture of some individuals not only committing the crime, but actually getting away with the proceeds. This prospect of an unseen fortune still out there somewhere has fueled countless articles, books, and documentaries. It transforms the story from a mere crime report into a tantalizing treasure hunt, one that the public imagination has never quite given up on, even after all these years of silence and speculation. Jack Mills passed away in February 1970 at the age of 64 from leukemia. However, his family always maintained that the head injuries he sustained during the robbery contributed to his declining health and premature death. While a direct causal link was medically debated, the trauma undoubtedly blighted the last 7 years of his life. His story serves as a vital and sobering counter-narrative to the often romanticized tale of the Great Train Robbery. It reminds us that behind the headlines and the myths there was real human suffering, a cost that is too often overlooked in the retelling of daring crimes.
Initially, there was widespread public sympathy for Jack Mills and his co-driver David Whitby, who was also manhandled. They were seen as brave men who had endured a terrifying ordeal. However, as the years passed and the robbers, particularly figures like Ronnie Biggs, became romanticized in the media, the focus often shifted away from the victims. The narrative increasingly celebrated the audacity of the criminals and their subsequent escapades, while the suffering of Mills was frequently downplayed or even forgotten. This shift in public perception is a sobering aspect of the robbery's legacy, highlighting how easily victims can be overshadowed by their perpetrators.
Amidst the sensationalism, the manhunts, and the tales of daring escapes, it is crucial to remember Jack Mills, the driver of the targeted mail train. He was not just a nameless cog in the system that the robbers outwitted. He was a 57-year-old working man simply doing his job on the night of August 8, 1963. During the robbery, as he tried to explain that he couldn't move the train as instructed because the brakes were not set up correctly, he was struck over the head with an iron bar wielded by one of the gang members. This act of violence had devastating and lasting consequences for him. The physical and psychological impact of the attack on Jack Mills was severe. He suffered serious head injuries that led to chronic, debilitating headaches and traumatic epilepsy. He was in constant pain for much of the remainder of his life. He attempted to return to work on the railways, but was unable to resume his duties as a driver due to his injuries. Instead, he was given lighter, office-based tasks. The robbery didn't just steal money, it stole Jack Mills's health, his career, and his peace of mind. The glamour often associated with the robbers stands in stark contrast to the grim reality faced by their primary victim.
The media plays a crucial role in shaping these perceptions. By focusing on the adventure and the personalities of the robbers, rather than the consequences of their actions, a certain allure can be created. Buster Edwards, after his release from prison, even ran a flower stall near Waterloo Station, becoming a minor celebrity. This transformation from notorious train robber to seemingly harmless local character is indicative of how time and media portrayal can soften the edges of even serious crimes, contributing to a complex and often contradictory public memory of such events.
This tendency to romanticize certain types of criminals, particularly those involved in audacious heists that don't appear to result in immediate fatalities, is a curious but recurring phenomenon. The Great Train Robbers became symbols of something more than just thieves. They were seen as anti-establishment figures, ordinary blokes who took on the system and won. Their stories, filled with daring plans, narrow escapes, and life on the run, provided thrilling narratives that overshadowed the reality of their crimes.
The media portrayal of figures like Buster Edwards often veered into romanticization. He was depicted as a charming, almost lovable rogue, a family man forced into crime who yearned for normal existence. This narrative was significantly amplified by the 1988 film Buster, which starred musician Phil Collins in the title role. The film focused on Edwards' relationship with his wife June and his life as a fugitive, presenting a sanitized and sympathetic view of his character. This portrayal shaped public perception, turning a convicted criminal into a folk hero figure for a new generation.
Charles Buster Edwards was another prominent member of the Great Train Robbery gang, known for his exploits as a club owner and small-time crook. After the robbery, he managed to evade capture, fleeing with his wife and daughter to Mexico. He lived there for a couple of years, spending his share of the loot. However, the call of home and dwindling funds eventually led him to negotiate his surrender. In 1966, he returned to England and gave himself up to the police, receiving a 15-year prison sentence. The subsequent international manhunt, the dramatic arrests, the lengthy trial, and particularly the daring escapes like that of Ronnie Biggs added layer upon layer of intrigue and adventure to the story. Biggs's decades-long evasion of justice in Brazil, living openly and taunting the authorities, transformed him into a global media figure. This extended saga kept the robbery in the headlines and in public consciousness for far longer than most crimes. It became more than just a single event. It evolved into an ongoing drama, complete with heroes, at least for some, villains and unresolved mysteries like the identity of the Ulsterman. Ultimately, the Great Train Robbery fascinates because it combines so many compelling elements: a high-stakes heist, a colorful cast of characters, dramatic escapes, police procedural, and the enduring mystery of the missing money. The fact that most of the loot, over £2 million, was never recovered adds a final tantalizing question mark. Where did it go? Who benefited? This unresolved element ensures that the story never quite feels finished, allowing speculation and myth to continue to flourish. It's a story that has been retold countless times in books, films, documentaries, and songs, each iteration cementing its place in the annals of criminal folklore.
There's also an element of the David versus Goliath narrative, however skewed that perception might be. A group of men, mostly from working-class backgrounds, taking on the might of the British establishment, the Royal Mail, the railways, the police, and, for a brief period, appearing to outwit them all. This underdog aspect, even when the underdogs are criminals, often resonates in popular storytelling. It taps into a latent anti-authoritarian streak, a fascination with those who dare to challenge the system, regardless of their motives. The meticulous planning, even with its flaws, hinted at a level of cunning that many found intriguing.
Over 60 years have passed since the Glasgow to Euston mail train was ambushed, yet the Great Train Robbery continues to hold a powerful grip on the public imagination. What is it about this particular crime that ensures its enduring legacy? Part of the answer undoubtedly lies in the sheer scale and audacity of the theft. In 1963, £2.6 million was an almost unimaginable sum of money, the largest cash robbery in British history at the time. The image of a gang of ordinary criminals successfully stopping a Royal Mail train and making off with such a fortune was and remains inherently dramatic and captivating. And so the legend of the Great Train Robbery lives on, not just as a tale of crime, but as a myth etched into Britain's history. If stories like this fascinate you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more true legends and hidden myths from around the world.